Today's topic is one of the darkest I've ever covered. We're talking about schizophrenia, not the movie version, not the internet myths, the real thing. A disorder that can twist reality, fracture identity, and in rare cases, lead to unimaginable horror. We're diving deep into what it is, how it works, and the terrifying crimes committed by those lost inside it. So buckle up, grab a drink, maybe turn a light on, and let's talk about schizophrenia. Alright, so, schizophrenia. I know, not exactly the kind of thing people are racing to click on, but I think that's exactly why we should talk about it. This disorder is one of the most misunderstood, feared, and honestly, twistedly fascinating things about the human mind. Not because it makes people crazy like horror movies want you to think, but because it reveals just how fragile our grip on reality really is. And yeah, we're gonna talk about the brutal stuff too. Because unfortunately, when this illness is ignored, misdiagnosed, or left untreated, things can go very dark. This video will cover what schizophrenia actually is, how it messes with perception, and then we'll get into some real-life cases, some of which are disturbing, graphic, and straight-up horrifying. So if that's not your thing, fair warning. But for those of you still here, let's descend into the rabbit hole of a mind turned against itself. So before we get into the stories, I want to slow down and actually talk about what schizophrenia is. Because let's be honest, we've all heard the word. We've seen it thrown around in headlines, movies, and probably in some sketchy true crime YouTube thumbnails. But very few people actually understand it. Schizophrenia isn't just hearing voices or acting weird. It's not some cartoonish mental breakdown where someone throws on a straitjacket and starts ranting about aliens. It's something way more terrifying, because it distorts your entire perception of the world, slowly, quietly, and often without you even realizing it's happening. At its core, schizophrenia is a chronic brain disorder. That word, chronic, is important. This isn't a phase, a mood swing, or a bad day. This is something that latches onto your mind like a parasite and stays with you for life. Most people develop symptoms in their late teens to early 20s, though it can show up later. And that's horrifying, right? Imagine you're in your early 20s, trying to figure out your life, your future, who you even are, and then slowly, your brain starts feeding you lies. Not just emotional lies like anxiety or depression, but visual lies, auditory lies, entire fake realities. That's the thing about schizophrenia. It's not just mental. It's sensory. It hijacks what you see, hear, and believe. Reality becomes this shifting, unstable mess where you don't know if your thoughts are your own anymore. The symptoms are broken into three big categories: positive, negative, and cognitive. Let's start with positive symptoms, which, ironically, are the bad ones. Positive here just means something extra is happening. Your brain is adding stuff to your reality that shouldn't be there. These are your hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech, paranoia. Some people hear voices, and I don't mean whispers or vague suggestions. I mean literal voices, like someone sitting next to you screaming into your ear, only there's no one there. Sometimes they tell you to do things. Sometimes they tell you that you're worthless. Sometimes they scream about death, or God, or the FBI. And sometimes they just won't shut up. Then we have delusions. These are false beliefs you can't let go of. And I'm not talking about thinking you're better at your job than you are. I mean full-blown. I am being hunted by the government, or my neighbor is poisoning my food, or I am the chosen prophet of an alien race and I must complete my mission type beliefs. Now think about how dangerous that is when you believe it 100%. When your brain tells you the impossible, and there's no voice of reason left to counter it. Next are the negative symptoms, and these are less flashy but just as devastating. They include things like flattened emotion, lack of motivation, withdrawal from people, and loss of pleasure in life. These are the things that make someone look like they've shut down. Like the lights are on but no one's home. A person might stop taking care of themselves, stop speaking, stop trying. Then there's the cognitive symptoms, and this is where the illness messes with your ability to think clearly. Planning, remembering, organizing thoughts, focusing, all of it becomes a struggle. Sometimes the person can't even string together a coherent sentence, because their thoughts are all colliding at once like a mental traffic jam. Now here's the really dark part. A lot of people with schizophrenia experience something called anosognosia. That's a fancy word for you don't know you're sick. Imagine that. You're seeing things, hearing voices, believing that your neighbor is a demon trying to kill you. And when someone tries to help, your brain tells you they're the enemy. So you don't trust doctors. You don't take your meds. And to you, the hallucinations aren't hallucinations. They're real. This is your reality. It's terrifying. Not just because it's dangerous, but because it's invisible. You can't see schizophrenia on an X-ray. There's no physical wound. And yet, it can completely destroy someone's life, from the inside out. And even with treatment, there's no cure. Antipsychotics can help reduce the symptoms, sure. Therapy and support are essential. But for many people, it's a lifelong battle. A constant effort to stay grounded in a world that constantly shifts beneath them. And look, not everyone with schizophrenia becomes violent. That's important to say. In fact, most don't. But when violence does happen, it's often because the person has been abandoned, untreated, or pushed past the edge by voices they can't escape and fears they think are real. And that's when tragedies happen. So yeah, schizophrenia is one of the most misunderstood mental illnesses out there. And honestly, that's what makes it so scary. Because it's not just about the people who suffer from it. It's about how little we as a society actually understand what's going on inside the human mind when everything goes wrong. So how has society treated people with schizophrenia over time? Badly. Really badly. In medieval Europe, if you heard voices or saw visions, congratulations. You were probably called possessed and either locked away, beaten, or killed. Fast forward to the 19th century and the answer was asylums. If you've ever seen old photographs of Victorian-era institutions, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. People chained to walls, abused, starved, and forgotten. Then came the 20th century and the rise of treatments, electroshock therapy, lobotomies, insulin comas. People were experimented on in ways that were borderline torture. This wasn't therapy, it was damage control, and not even good damage control. So yeah, not exactly a proud moment for psychiatry. Alright, so now that we've covered what schizophrenia actually is, let's get into one of the most disturbing cases ever associated with it. Now this is the one I guarantee some of you already know, the Greyhound bus murder. But I need to warn you up front, this is not easy to hear. It's not flashy horror movie violence. It's slow, confusing, and terrifying in a way that sticks with you long after you hear it. This is the story of what happened on Greyhound Bus 1170, in the middle of nowhere, on a quiet highway in Canada. So, the date is July 30th, 2008, a seemingly normal summer day. Greyhound Bus 1170 is making its way through the rural landscape of Manitoba, heading west toward Winnipeg. It's late evening, just around 6:01 p.m., and the bus is about half full, mostly quiet passengers keeping to themselves, listening to music, reading, or just watching the scenery pass. Among the passengers is 22-year-old Tim McLean. He's a young guy, charismatic, friendly, working as a carnival worker just trying to get home. He's sitting near the back of the bus, headphones in, leaning against the window, completely relaxed. Now, also on that bus, about halfway through the ride, a man boards at a small stop in Erickson. He's quiet, doesn't talk to anyone, sits near the front at first, then about an hour into the ride, he gets up and moves, walks silently toward the back, and sits down in the empty seat next to Tim. That man's name is Vince Lee, and this is where things start to get chilling. See, Vince wasn't just another passenger. He was in the middle of a full-blown schizophrenic psychotic break, and no one knew. He had been showing signs for years. Paranoia, erratic behavior. He believed voices were speaking to him. Voices he thought were coming from God, or aliens, or some shadowy force beyond comprehension. He believed he was being hunted, that he had a mission, that something or someone needed to be stopped, or he would be destroyed. He'd been drifting around Canada in the days leading up to the attack, taking on random jobs, barely sleeping, and acting increasingly bizarre. His wife had left him. His mental health was in absolute collapse. But he hadn't hurt anyone yet, and so, like so many others, he slipped through the cracks. And now he was sitting next to Tim McLean, a total stranger, and silently watching him. For about 20 minutes, nothing happens. Tim has no idea what's coming. And then, without any warning, Vince suddenly pulls out a large hunting knife from his bag and starts stabbing Tim. And I don't mean once or twice. I mean dozens of times. In total silence. No shouting, no threats. Just brutal mechanical violence. Passengers start screaming. The driver slams the brakes. Everyone rushes off the bus. One brave man tries to intervene and gets slashed in the hand. The bus doors are locked from the outside, trapping Vince inside with the body. Police are called. Chaos erupts on the side of the highway. And then it gets worse. After Tim is dead, Vince doesn't stop. In full view of the horrified passengers outside the bus windows, he begins beheading the corpse. Slowly. Methodically. He holds up Tim's head to the windows. He begins mutilating the body, cutting out organs, and eating parts of the flesh right there in front of everyone. You can't make this up. The entire thing was so surreal, so nightmarish, that at first responders thought they were dealing with a drug-fueled maniac, or someone performing some kind of ritualistic act. But no, Vince wasn't high. He wasn't drunk. He was completely overtaken by untreated schizophrenia. When police finally subdued him hours later, he was calm, cooperative. He told them he had to kill Tim because he believed Tim was an alien, or possibly a demon, sent to kill him. He said he had no choice. That the voices told him it had to be done. That was his reality. In the months that followed, Vince Lee underwent psychiatric evaluation. It was determined he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, and he had absolutely no insight into his condition. He was found not criminally responsible for the murder. And instead of prison, he was sent to a psychiatric facility. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's not justice. That's not enough. How could someone do something so monstrous and then walk away without a life sentence? But here's where the conversation gets murky and terrifying. Because Vince wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He wasn't some sadistic murderer looking for pleasure or revenge. He was a man whose brain had turned against him, whose reality had been so warped by untreated psychosis that he genuinely believed he was acting in self-defense. In a sense, he thought he was the victim. In the years that followed, Vince underwent treatment, took his medication, participated in therapy, and, by all clinical accounts, he improved. He changed his name to Will Baker, was granted supervised release, then unsupervised release, and eventually, full freedom. Yeah, you heard that right. The man who beheaded and cannibalized someone on a bus now lives freely in Canada, with a new identity. Now, whether you believe that's right or not is a whole other conversation. But it raises the terrifying question. What do we do with people whose minds completely unravel, and who commit unspeakable acts not out of malice, but out of delusion? Because here's the truth. Vince Lee didn't snap overnight. There were signs. There were moments. There were opportunities to intervene, to treat him, to help him, to stop him, long before that bus ride ever happened. But like so many others, he was just another man slipping through the cracks until it was too late. And that's what makes this story so haunting. Because it wasn't just about one man's psychosis. It was about what happens when society stops paying attention, when we pretend mental illness isn't dangerous, when we turn our backs on the people who need help the most, and only look up when the blood starts to spill. So, if you thought the Greyhound case was horrifying, this next story takes us somewhere way darker. Because this isn't just a case of untreated schizophrenia. This isn't just a story about violence or delusions. This is a story about what happens when the human mind completely breaks down and starts feeding on blood. This is the story of Richard Chase, the man they would later call the Vampire of Sacramento. And I promise you, it's just as disturbing as it sounds. Let's go back to 1950, when Chase was born in California. From the outside, things looked normal. His family wasn't perfect, his father was strict, his mother distant, but nothing that screamed future serial killer. He was a shy kid, kept to himself. But even then, there were signs. He started showing what psychiatrists call the McDonald triad, 3 behaviors that often show up in people who go on to commit extreme violence: bedwetting, animal cruelty, and fire setting. Richard hit all 3. He once killed a cat and smeared its blood on his face. And it wouldn't be the last time. By the time he hit his late teens, he was already slipping away from reality. He became convinced that people were poisoning him, that someone had stolen his pulmonary artery, that his stomach was rotting from the inside. He'd press oranges to his forehead because he believed the vitamin C would soak through his skull and fix his brain. And it only got worse. He started injecting himself with animal blood. Seriously. He'd blend up raw organs, inject them, and believe it was keeping him alive. He thought his blood was evaporating and that he needed to replace it constantly, or he'd die. That's when the voices started. That's when the delusions became commands. And that's when Richard Chase went from mentally ill to deadly. In 1977, after years of spiraling untreated schizophrenia, Chase began his killing spree. And let me warn you, this part isn't just disturbing, it's gruesome. On December 29, 1977, he committed his first murder. A 51-year-old man named Ambrose Griffin, a random victim. Chase drove by, pulled out a .22 caliber handgun, and shot him through the chest. No motive, no robbery, just a test, just a start. Weeks later, the real horror began. On January 23, 1978, Chase broke into the home of Teresa Wallen, a pregnant woman who was home alone. He shot her 3 times, once in the hand, once in the skull, and once in the back. Then he did something that still haunts every investigator who saw it. He mutilated her body. He performed acts of necrophilia. He cut out her organs, drank her blood, and stuffed dog feces into her mouth before leaving. This wasn't just murder. It was delusion-driven ritual. In his mind, he was dying, and her blood would save him. 3 days later, he escalated even further. On January 27th, Chase entered the home of Evelyn Murath, a 38-year-old woman. Inside were her 6-year-old son, a male friend, and her 22-month-old nephew. Chase shot them all. Then he went after Evelyn. What he did to her defies comprehension. He drained her blood into a yogurt container and drank it. He removed multiple organs, bathed in the blood, and performed more necrophilic acts. Then he kidnapped the 22-month-old and later cannibalized him. And the whole time, in his head, this wasn't evil. This was survival. This was a man with schizophrenia so advanced, so untreated, that reality was gone. His brain told him, "Your blood is disappearing. They are after you. You must kill. You must feed." He believed the Nazis were turning his blood to powder, that his heart would stop unless he consumed fresh blood. He had become the villain in his own delusion, and he was fully committed to the role. But thankfully, he got sloppy. After that last massacre, neighbors called the police, who found fingerprints, footprints, and a trail that led right to Chase's apartment. When police arrived, what they found was straight out of a horror movie. Inside were blood-stained dishes, rotting body parts in the blender, and a refrigerator full of animal organs. Blood was smeared across the floor, the walls, the sink. It wasn't a home. It was a butcher shop of insanity. Richard Chase was arrested without a fight. He was tried for 6 counts of murder. His defense argued for insanity. The prosecution said he knew what he was doing, that he fled the scene, hid evidence, tried to cover his tracks. But the jury saw the full picture: the schizophrenia, the hallucinations, the total psychotic break, and they still sentenced him to death. He didn't live long enough for the state to carry it out. In 1980, just 2 years after the murders, Richard Chase committed suicide in his cell, overdosing on antidepressants he'd been hoarding. His last words? Unknown. But the terror he left behind? That stayed. So what can we learn from this? We can learn that schizophrenia isn't just hearing voices. It isn't just being weird or crazy. It's a disorder that can fracture a person's entire reality. And when it goes untreated, when it's fed by isolation, fear, and delusion, it can become something unrecognizable, something monstrous. Now look, most people with schizophrenia never become violent. That's important to say. Most are more likely to hurt themselves than anyone else. But when someone like Richard Chase falls through the cracks, when their madness is left to evolve on its own, that's when we get monsters. Not because they were born evil, but because their minds turned against them, and nobody stopped it. Richard Chase wasn't a vampire. He was a man who thought he was dying, and who thought that the only way to live was to take life from someone else. Here's where I want to clear something up. Most people with schizophrenia are not violent. In fact, they're more likely to be victims than attackers. Violent outbursts usually only happen when the illness is combined with other factors, like substance abuse, homelessness, isolation, or lack of treatment. But when those delusions do turn dark and there's no support system in place, that's when tragedies happen, like we've seen. Okay, quick weird side note because this one's always stuck with me. Remember the 1994 incident in Zimbabwe where a bunch of school children said they saw a UFO land and strange beings step out? Some of the kids were later evaluated by psychologists, and one of the theories was that it may have been a collective psychotic episode, like a mass hallucination. Others said the kids were showing signs of shared delusions, similar to prodromal schizophrenia. Not saying they were all mentally ill, but that's just how powerful the mind is. It can make multiple people see the same thing, even if it's not real. One of the most heartbreaking and terrifying aspects of schizophrenia is the auditory hallucinations. These aren't whispers or vague thoughts. These are voices, loud, aggressive, constant. Some scream, some mock, some command. There are cases where people genuinely thought the voices were God, the devil, aliens, or even their own dead relatives. And some of those voices tell them to kill. It's not an excuse, but it is the explanation behind so many of these tragic, brutal acts. When you believe a voice is coming from a divine being, you'll do things no sane person would. Despite all of this, despite how dark this condition can get, schizophrenia is treatable. Not curable, but manageable. There are antipsychotics that help. Therapy helps. Routine helps. Family support helps. But the biggest enemy? Stigma. People are scared to ask for help. Or worse, they don't even know they need it. And because of that, people suffer in silence until it's too late. We have to stop treating mental illness like a moral failure. It's not weakness. It's biology. It's chemistry. It's trauma. Schizophrenia is a nightmare you can't wake up from. For the people living with it, and the people who become victims because of it, this isn't fiction. It's real. And it's tragic. But if we understand it, maybe we can stop the next tragedy. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to some of the darkest corners of the human experience with an open mind. I appreciate it. Thanks for sticking through this one. I know it was heavy, but I think these are the stories we need to talk about. Because when we ignore mental illness, we don't make it go away. We just let it grow in the dark. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like, comment, and all that YouTube stuff. But more importantly, take care of yourself and each other. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.